So let's work on making our projectile a little more intelligent. So I still have my snowball. It's not prefabbed yet, and I prefer to work in the scene level until I'm ready to prefab this thing, just to be able to test it a little bit easier. Now we can break the prefabs relationship as needed, but I'm going to rename the state. So I have my snowball selected. Now remember, this is the thing that just goes flying through the air. And on this state, normally I would call this idle because it's just kind of doing whatever it's programmed to do in this state, which is adding force. And I'm going to collapse the add force for now. I'll come back and take a closer look at that later. But what I want to do is I want to add a system event, and the system event that I'm listening for is an on collision enter. Now, this collision enter is going to fire when it hits anything, and so we'll just pass this over to a new state. For now, I'll call this hit something, and let's give this a test. So now it doesn't really matter what it hits, but when it hits anything, it's passing to this hit something state. So I could fire another one, and if my aim was better, we're definitely going to need some kind of heads-up display in our crosshairs. I'm trying to hit the snowman over here. But you can see it's passing it off to the hit something state. Now, from the hit something state, what we're going to do is we're going to pull out the collision event information. And we can do that by going into the physics category. And I'll just use this get collision info. And we'll use this to kind of to pass information around as needed. So I'll just add the get collision info. Now what we're going to do is the game object hit, we're going to store the object that we hit. And based on that, we can really start to pass around relevant information. Okay, so I'm just going to jump in and create a variable. And this is, I'll call this hit object. And we're going to set this as a game object, and we'll add that. We'll go back to the state, and we'll just store that as the hit object. Now we can do other things. We can store the velocity and the speed and the contact points, and there's some very useful information in there. But we just want to kind of store whatever object we're hitting. I'll turn debug on, and so now if I have my snowball selected, whatever that object hits, you can see that it's storing that object here. In this case, it was cube 4. I didn't really name that properly, but I'll go back and modify that. So as I throw these snowballs around, I got quite an arm on me here if I can throw a snowball that far, but you can start to see that as I select these objects, we'll start to get different results here in the object hit depending on what it hit. Okay, so we're gonna use that to kind of filter some of this information and pass it to objects that we've hit. Okay. So once we've determined that we hit something, we're getting the collision info of the hit object. So we're effectively storing whatever object this projectile hit. Now what we'll do is we're gonna filter this based on tags. And then we can essentially use the same snowball for the enemy or for the player and just fling it at anything. And based on whatever it hits, we can make some decisions about how to manage that collision. So I'm going to go into game objects, and I'm looking for a tag compare. And I don't see it, so I'm just going to do a quick search for tag and let this... There we go. Game object compare tag. I was in the wrong category, that's why. So this is under logic instead of a game object. So I'm going to do a game object compare tag. And what we can do is the game object that we're looking for is not a direct object link. So we're not going to drag the object in here. What we're going to do is we're going to compare this against the hit object. So whatever object we hit, it's going to load that. And we'll do a tag compare. And so what we'll do is I'm going to set this, I'm going to set an enemy tag here just to test this. So I'm going to go into the tag drop-down menu and choose to add tag. I'm going to add a new tag, and this will be enemy. And now if I go back to my snowball, in this tag drop-down menu, we should have an enemy tag. So now I'm looking for the enemy tag, And I'll just go over here to all these cubes that I have. Let's see, let me try to find my cubes. There we go. These are all my cubes. I'll see if I can select all of them at the same time. Should be able to do that. And set all of those as enemy objects. Okay, so now my hierarchy is a little disorganized here, and I might take some time just to kind of clean that up. I'll just drag these objects around to kind of re-index them. But now, when my snowball flies and hits this, we should get the collision info. We're going to filter the hit object, and based on whether this is an enemy or not, we're going to fire off a true event. So I'm going to create an event called hit enemy. And I'll add that as a transition, and we'll just add this to a state over here so that when that state fires, we know that this will have hit an enemy. Okay, so for a true event, I'll use my hit enemy state, and all that should work just fine. So if I hit the play button, as long as that hits the enemy first, there we go, we fire it off to state 1. Okay, now if I take this snowball, if I can find it here, and again, I'm not launching this snowball. I'll just kind of move this off to the side so that it kind of flings off and hits the terrain object. We'll just toss this. Okay, so you can see here that it fired. It definitely hit something, but it did not resolve through the enemy hit because it hit the terrain first. Okay, so I know that that's working fairly well, at least the way that I intend it to work, and I'll add a little bit of nuance to this a bit later. So I'll go back and refine this. I'll call this enemy has been hit, and then we can decide what we want to do once the enemy gets hit. And what we'll do is we'll set up a little scenario where we maybe take some health off of the enemy object, or we destroy the object outright. But right now this is a very simple setup. I'll add just a little bit more nuance to it so we know we're getting the collision info that we need from this snowball. We're doing a game object compare tag, and we're testing whether or not we hit the enemy. Okay, now I'm going to do the same thing. We'll do game object compare tag again, and we'll test against the hit object, and this time we're going to test against untagged. Now my terrain object should be showing up as untagged, so I'm going to my terrain. There's untagged. Okay, I'll go back to my snowball. So now I'm going to create, this is kind of a general transition, or a general state that if I hit anything that's untagged, we'll create an event and we'll say hit untagged. So anything that's not tagged, we'll add that as a transition. So in this case, if I hit the terrain, we should end up in the hit untagged, not untagger, untagged, there we go. And so now we should be able to test this. Let me just make sure this is all wired okay. So we're going to fire off a true event. We'll hit untagged. So now when I hit the play button, if this snowball hits the enemy, it says it hit the enemy, which is exactly what we want. I'll move this snowball over so it hits the terrain. I'll hit the play button, so now we should end up on the hit untagged. Unless I hit the enemy. I think I might have hit the enemy again. So let's kind of move that over just a little bit further. Hit the play button. There we go. So I kind of grazed the enemy last time. So we know right now that this snowball is sort of semi-smart. And based on this, we could do a couple of interesting things. We could, if we hit the enemy, not only could we take health off of our enemy, but we could also destroy the snowball. But let's say we miss our target. If we miss our target, we could keep the snowball alive, convert it into a pickup object for our enemy to pick up and throw back at us. So we can really kind of do some interesting things the minute that we have a semi-intelligent projectile. Now, I could set up a game object compare tag for player as well, and then just use this exact same object. This ultimately is going to be a prefab, so that my snowman can start lobbing those back at me. And if it hits me, well, it's going to do some damage based on whatever I have the player wired to do. But we'll push that mechanic forward in the next presentation. But for now, Set up your scene and set up this basic first-person mechanic to where you can run around and launch snowballs. And set up a situation similar to this where on the snowball, we're adding force from our idle state, but then we have a system event where we have a collision enter. That will detect any kind of collision that this ball comes into contact with. And from there we can do some basic sorting. After we get the collision info, we'll store that hit object in a variable, and then we can test against that variable. So get that set up. In the next presentation, we'll push this a little farther forward. We'll refine the snowball a little bit, and we'll start to focus on the enemies. But we'll do that in the next presentation.